Hello, and welcome to episode 15 of Sorastro's Marvel Crisis Protocol painting series. In this video, we're going to paint Deadpool from Atomic Mass Games' Marvel Crisis Protocol. The Deadpool miniature is another incredibly dynamic figure with lots of character. The outfit itself has quite a simple but striking colour scheme, and the rocket blast is a lot of fun to paint. I'll also be indulging in some non-metallic metalwork for the rocket itself, as well as the katanas. Here's a quick overview of the painting process. I'm going to begin by assembling the figure, choosing from the several different available options for the pose, before priming in black, followed with some zenithal highlights as usual. I've also chosen to use the airbrush to quickly create the gradients for the Fwoosh effect, followed with some edge highlights. Next I've chosen to paint the rocket blast, where I'll be sticking to the brush to create a similar effect to that shown in the Green Goblin PDF guide, which means using some fluorescent fiery tones along with some matte grey colours for the smoke. I'm then going to paint Deadpool, providing him with base colours, some general overhead highlights, and some non-metallic metal effects for the blades. After attaching Deadpool to the rocket, I'll be providing my finishing touches, which will include painting the rocket itself, along with a little orange object source lighting, and some final refinements. Let's begin. The figure comes with a choice of 4 different heads, as well as alternative options for the torso and the right leg. Assembly is nice and simple once you've decided which parts you'd like to use. Here I'm just trying out some of the different heads. I've chosen to leave the scabbard off the figure for now, and here I'm just filling the hole where it attaches with some white tack to protect it from the primer, so that I'll be gluing plastic to plastic later on. And I'm doing the same thing with the point at which the foot will eventually be glued to the rocket. I'm now priming the separate parts in black, and I'm providing some grey and white zenithal highlights from above as usual. I might also sketch in the values for some potential object source lighting. Here you can see the different facial expressions a bit more clearly. For the rocket blast, I've lightened up the smoke with Vallejo's Cold Grey, and I'm now using white to push the brightness on the blast nearest to the rocket all the way up to pure white. I've also chosen to save some time with the lettering by using the airbrush to lay down the main gradients, firstly with the grey, and now the white. This is the Iwata HPC Plus airbrush, which has a 0.3mm nozzle. I'm now going to spray some fire red into the dark end of each gradient. This will naturally turn out pretty dark and desaturated because of the black underneath. If you want a brighter red, you could simply prime the lettering in white first. If you don't have an airbrush, you could of course achieve a similar result using the brush and standard blending techniques. It would just take a fair bit longer. I'm applying these colours in a couple of thin layers. Next I'm going to spray some sun yellow into the lighter end of each gradient. I then finished the lettering off with some edge highlights using Scalecolor's Tenere Yellow. You could glue this onto the finished miniature or keep it off as I'm doing if you want to keep your options open. Next I'm going to paint the rocket blast. I'm going to first colour the brightest parts of the blast using an orangey yellow tone made of some fluorescent yellow mixed with a little orange yellow by Green Stuff World, and you could use any warm yellow tone you like here. I'll then be using the more orangey Fluorescent Red from the Vallejo model Air range for the lower parts of the blasts. So here I'm just applying a single thin layer of the orangey yellow to the area nearest the rocket. This can be loosely feathered out with a damp brush to create a gentle gradient. I'm now introducing some of the darker Fluorescent Red and applying this further down the blast. This can also be feathered out. I'm now simply building up the concentration of the orange the further we get from the rocket, loosely blending and feathering as I go. Next I'm going to use some bluish grey tones to add some smoky textures to the lower half of the plume. You could use whatever grey tones you like for this, although I do find the matte finish of the Scalecolor line works well for rendering these types of effect. I'm starting with a mix of Anthracite Gray and Graphite. You can see I'm mainly stippling this on, and I'm using a cheaper synthetic brush to do so, in this case one of the new Designer Red Dot brushes by Rosemary & Co. I'm mainly targeting the more raised areas, leaving some orange to show through in the recesses. This is already looking pretty good, and you could stop and call this done whenever you like. I'm now mixing in some black for the denser or more shadowed areas of smoke. There are no hard and fast rules here, of course. I'm just playing around with different levels to see what looks best. To create a more striking inner fire effect, we can use some pure white to brighten up some of the glowing recesses. And then brush the fiery tones on top. I'm now painting the base as in the previous episodes, using mainly Stonewall Grey, but I've also mixed in a small amount of Sol Yellow and Mars Orange to create just a subtle ambience. A light dry brush using a warm ivory tone such as Tyrant Skull can also work well here. I'm now returning to the rocket blast to make a few final adjustments, including adding some white into the grey for the areas that are closest to the rocket. I might tweak things further later on. Next, I'm going to paint Deadpool. I'm going to start by painting the red outfit, and I've chosen to map out my initial light and shade at the base colour stage to save time when it comes to adding the highlights. For the shadow tone, I've chosen to use deep red mixed with some violet, and for the main areas of highlights, I'm using blood red. Here I'm mixing the darker tone, and I'm now thinning the blood red just enough to get the paint to flow nicely. It's then just a question of blocking in the areas of light and shade using the two tones. I might do a little wet blending to help smooth out some of the transitions, such as you can see here. It's It's okay if things are a little rough at this stage, as we can return to do some refining later on. One of the main advantages of working in this way is that we can achieve a bright, vibrant tone in the highlights in a single pass, especially when working over zenithal highlights, where the light tones beneath allow the red to really shine. We will of course be adding some additional highlights here in a moment, but a lot of the work is already being done. Another, faster approach might be to simply apply a thinned base tone over the zenithal highlights, although the initial results might be a little on the desaturated side. We can of course use some intermediate tones to also help bridge the gap between shadow and highlight. I'm now just doing a little tidying up, and I'm also checking for any areas where the coverage feels a little thin. Next I'm painting all of the areas of black, using black mixed with some Anthracite Gray. Not using pure black here means we've got room to add some even darker shadows or lining afterwards if we like. I'm now using some white sands to brighten the eyes. And I'm returning to the black to paint the surrounding area, trimming the eyes back as I go. Here I'm just painting the buckle which I missed earlier. Next I'm painting the areas of brown leather, using brown leather mixed with a little violet. I'm now using graphite for the small metallic details. And I've chosen to use Abyssal Blue for the blades of the katanas. I've now decided to add a little black lining to help with the definition. and I'm tidying up any lines that came out a little thick. With the base colours complete, I'm now going to move on to the highlights, starting with the red suit. But I'm first going to mix some black into the darker base tone to add some extra depth and definition to some of the shadows. And I'm now returning to the pure blood red to tighten up and reinforce some of the highlights I applied earlier. I'm now going to brighten the highlights further using a roughly equal mix of Antares Red and Fuchsia. I pretty quickly ended up jumping to the pure Antares Red and Fuchsia mix. I'm now mixing in some Tenere Yellow to go brighter still, but I'm keeping the highlights quite tightly focused. To create some small specular highlights, I might even apply some spots of pure Tenere Yellow. And then glaze some of the Antares Red and Fuchsia mix on top. I'm now just going back and forth a bit with the highlights and glazes. I'll be returning to finish the red off in a while. Next I'm going to highlight the black sections of the outfit by firstly highlighting up from the base tone to pure Anthracite Gray, before adding some white sands to achieve the brightest highlights. This is now pure Anthracite Gray. And I'm now mixing in some white sands. I'm also playing with some pretty bright specular glints here too. Next I'm going to highlight the brown leather by firstly highlighting up to Arabic Shadow from the base tone, before once again adding some Tenere Yellow for the brightest highlights. This is now pure Arabic Shadow. And here I'm adding the Tenere Yellow. I often like to create a more textured look when working with leather. I just chose to go for a slightly cleaner, almost comic-like appearance on this occasion. I've now decided to add some white sands for my brightest highlights, just to control the levels of yellow. For the katana blades, I'm going to build up my highlights by adding some Hykey Yellow, then some Purity White to the Abyssal Blue base tone. I generally prefer paints with a more satin finish when working with non-metallic metal effects. You can see I've already sketched out my tones on the other katana whilst testing out my colours. Naturally, I want some nice sharp edge highlights. And there's nothing wrong with backtracking to extend out some of the midtones if necessary. To help smooth out the gradient, I might use a couple of thin layers of highlight, always moving the brush in the direction of the lighter areas. This is now just Hykey Yellow and Purity White. With the main gradients in place, I'm now going to glaze some Joryldin Turquoise into some of the midtones. Vallejo's blue-green or light turquoise also work well for this. Elsewhere on the blades, I'm also brushing some of the red from the suit to help create the impression of a reflective surface. Once we're happy with the tones, we can finish the blades off with some optional scratches. The same highlight tones can also be used for the other metallic details on the outfit. I'm now gluing the scabbard into place. And I'm gluing Deadpool to the rocket. With that done, we're now ready to add some finishing touches. I'm now going to paint the rocket using the same tones that were used for the katanas. I left the rocket till last because I knew I wanted to incorporate tones from the surrounding model. Beyond that, I don't really have a plan as to how I'm going to paint it, so what you're seeing is somewhat improvisatory. My basic approach, however, is to play around with the profile of light and dark using the bluish grayscale, then begin adding colours from the surrounding environment, along with some bright specular highlights. You can see that I'm creating reflective shapes that loosely follow the contours of the rocket. And here I'm just playing around with different marks and textures to see what works. I'm now placing some red roughly where I might imagine a reflection of Deadpool's suit. I'm then reducing the size and intensity of the red with some more neutral reflections until I'm happy with the overall look. I'm also trying some thinner layers of red. And here I'm now introducing some of the yellow and orange tones of the rocket blast, brushed over some bright patches of highlight. As well as adding some very bright reflective glints, I'm also reinforcing the darker areas with some black, ideally one with a more satin finish, such as the Vallejo black or Decay black from the Scalecolor Fantasy and Games line. I'm now just freely playing around with the various elements. I'm now going to add a limited amount of object source lighting to Deadpool, mainly by lightening up the values of the affected areas. Then brushing some of the Fluorescent Red on top. I might include some small specular glints just as we did earlier with the general highlights. Here I'm just seeing how far I can take things. You could also brush a little orange onto the katana if you like. Next I'm sprinkling a little urban rubble onto the base over a layer of thinned PVA glue. And I'm now just making a few final tweaks and refinements that include some small adjustments to the eyes, as well as the rocket blast. And this completes Deadpool. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed the episode. Do feel free to follow me on social media to keep up to date with what I'm working on, which includes a growing collection of free PDF guides for miniatures that I don't have time to cover with a video. My sincerest thanks go to my amazing patrons for funding this series. I simply couldn't produce these videos without them. Join me again soon as we continue painting miniatures for Marvel Crisis Protocol. Happy painting!